They were heroes during the lockdown. Then, overnight, they became criminals. The Freedom Convoy was more than a protest. For many, it was a psychological jailbreak. And the truckers who rolled into Ottawa in 2022 were cheered by Canadians from coast to coast to coast. Then the government decided to crush them. This episode of Disrupted isn't about Tamara Litch or Chris Barber. It's about the forgotten individuals, people like Guy Meister or Robert Donnell. Working class Canadians still trapped in courtrooms years later, punished for honking the wrong way. The Emergencies Act may have expired, but the political retaliation didn't. My guest is journalist and author Donna Laframboise, and her new book, Thank You Truckers, captures the movement as it really was. It wasn't the threat to democracy that journalists and politicians would have you believe. It was a celebration of freedom, of national unity. Like Donna says, the real extremists weren't in the trucks, they were in office. I'm Melanie Bennett. This is Disrupted. Donna, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Your book came across my desk, Thank You Truckers, Canada's Heroes and Those Who Helped Them, which documents the 2022 Freedom Convoy protests and highlighting the public support of the movement, and also criticizing the government and the media response around the trucker convoy. So I would love to talk about this with you today. So why don't you first start, maybe give us an overview of your book and what you talk about in there?
Thank you. I'd love to. So this is the only book so far that documents ordinary people's stories. So there have been some really fabulous books written about the convoy up to this point, and they've either been this big picture, this is what happened, then this is what happened, then this is what happened, or they've been the personal stories of organizers or spokespeople. And those are all really important historical documents and part of a very important part of documenting what went on. And my book, I just went out and interviewed ordinary people. So they weren't famous, and they just got in their trucks, and I wanted to know why, and then what happened next, and what happened in Ottawa, and what happened afterwards. So I went to Ottawa actually as a photographer because something historic was going on, and I wanted to just take my camera and document that historic moment. And I spent a week there walking around, and I talked to some truckers, but most of the time actually I was standing back because I was photographing how the public was interacting with the truckers, and it was a big love fest. The people were coming up and thanking the truckers and begging them not to go and handing them cash and handing them here's a donated barbecue so you can cook outside, and here's a generator to run your lights, and here's food, and here's mittens, and here's hats, and it was this huge love fest with all of these Canadians just saying, we're behind you and we've got your back, and can we do your laundry and we'll bring it back tomorrow and it'll be clean and folded. And when else has that ever happened in a protest, when you have people coming to Ottawa and then all of these thousands of other Canadians saying, we're here for you, we're going to help you, we're going to make sure that you can get the message across to the leaders. So I was documenting that, and I went home and I was very concerned as when I was in Ottawa. I went with a friend who's not very political, and we would walk around together, and there, people would be laughing and dancing and hugging, and there was so much love and so much joy. And then we'd go back, and if you turned on the television news, you heard about far-right racists and terrorists and who were holding the city hostage. And it was just nothing like what we had just experienced on the street. And that was sort of a moment for my friend who just said, well, what's the point of watching the news? It's all bullshit. So that was a really important moment for her that, she wasn't expecting. And when I went home from the convoy, and I did the second week, and we didn't know how long it was going to go on. And, there's only long you can pay for a hotel room and you're not sure what's coming next. So I wasn't there for the terrible stuff that happened at the end, but I expected the media to snap out of it. I expected once, calmer heads are going to prevail, there's a little time has passed, we're going to start having now an accurate and an honest conversation about what happened in Ottawa. And that didn't seem to be happening at all. And then it was at that point that I decided that I guess I should be documenting these people's stories, because otherwise it's not going to happen. So afterwards, I had to sort of struggle a little bit to get names and numbers, because I hadn't actually collected that many, because I'm just taking photographs, right? So I was sending some truckers I knew, do you know this guy? A picture of this guy. Do you know how I can get in touch with him? But eventually people would say, oh, you have to talk to so and so. You have to talk to so and so. So it became very easy, actually, to learn the experiences, and they were great stories.
So you also wrote an article for the C2C Journal, which is what explained the book to me and the stories of the individuals who were at the protest, not necessarily just the truckers, but people who were there in solidarity and so on and so forth. And it really reminded me of the story. I don't know if you know the story of Daryl David. He was a black blues musician. In the 1980s, he befriended members of the KKK. And it all happened because these members of the KKK I think they were in a bar one night. And Daryl asked the KKK members, how can you hate me if you don't know me? And this, I guess, friendship blossomed, or they started getting to know each other, and all ended up in several of the members giving up their robes at the end. And so it's a story of how can you hate me if you don't know me, I think is really critical here. And in this case, the way your article described it is the government, the KKK in this story, hating without understanding. And also listened to another podcast you did recently with Tom Nelson, and you brought up that a police chief had said, anyone bringing food or money to the truckers will be hunted down. Again, how can you hate me if you don't know me? And this betrayal from the media afterwards, you said that you thought perhaps the media would change their tune. So did the media go in? We know that Pierre Poilievre did go meet some of the truckers, and he hasn't heard the end of it since. But I'm not sure any of the other politicians have. And so what are your thoughts on this?
So you're absolutely right. We have this thing going on in society now where if the political class and the media say that you should hate someone, then many people just kind of follow that, and they don't actually make any attempt to understand or to do some research on their own, or to get a different perspective. It's, the CBC says these are bad people, they must be bad people, and so yes, there was this incredible demonization before the truckers even got to Ottawa. We had our Prime Minister calling them, a fringe minority with unacceptable views. They haven't even got there yet. You haven't even had a conversation with them yet, and yet you are demonizing them. You are putting them outside of normal conversation. They're not worth having a conversation with, and that's a terrible thing. And it undermines democracy. It undermines us understanding each other. Canada is a big country with many different regions, and it used to be that the CBC used to claim that its role was to help diverse Canadians, understand each other, and instead what happened was the CBC, amongst other media outlets, just decided to adopt the very, very hateful, and I don't use that word very often, but a very hateful perspective of the government. These are just mangy dogs. We don't even have to talk to them. And the CBC was promoting that. But what's very interesting is that during the course of these interviews, I spoke to a number of truckers who said, I gave an interview to the CBC, or I gave an interview to CTV, and they told me I was going to be on the news, and then either I wasn't on at all, my interview had totally been shut down, or they took half a sentence of something I said. And in one guy's case, he said they made me look like a psycho because they only quoted me this. I had given them a 15-minute interview, and I had answered a lot of questions, and they used one tiny little bit, and in a way that's very deceptive. And in another case, the trucker was sitting there on Wellington in his blue Peterbilt, and his wife is in the passenger seat. So when the CBC crew comes up to his window, there's the cameraman, there's the sound guy, there's the journalist asking the questions. She filmed it. And I got to see that video afterwards. So that CBC crew did a very proper job. They asked questions, they let the trucker answer, they did their job. And then that film footage went back to the studio, and almost none of it made it on air. I think that, again, he said three words that this man said out of this entire interview got on the air. So things were happening in the editorial suites, they were being sliced and diced in the studio, even though journalists on the street had done their proper job. So there, what went on there is very, very alarming on many dimensions. And, it's something we should be talking about, but we're not.
Sort of. With the resignation of Trevor Danraj recently, who was at the CBC, has essentially come out and said that there are these editorial issues, that these decisions are being made at the top. And I think we're going to hear a lot more about that over the coming months and years, which I, for one, am looking forward to getting to understand a little bit better. Now, what your article does, and I imagine what your book also does, is, like you're saying, really humanizes the individual stories of people who were defending Canadian life, were defending freedom, their own personal freedom. And one of the points that I really enjoyed in the essay is pointing out that for nearly 2 years, these essential workers, these whether they're nurses or people who work in grocery stores or truckers even, were lauded as heroes of the country. They were keeping everything alive. They were keeping everything going at a time where we were all locked down. And all of a sudden, after the vaccine mandates, then suddenly they became the enemy of the country. They became, the like you said, the people with unacceptable views. And this really is a betrayal of the Canadians. And then the Canadian flag became the symbol of far-right hate, right? It was misogynists, often racists, and so on and so forth. And I was recently in England doing a report on migrant protests. And although they didn't have the same jubilant feel to it, it certainly was a similar situation where these are working class individuals who are affected by policies of the government, and they're expressing themselves by raising their own flag and saying, we are celebrating our own country. This is who we are. And the same thing is happening. They are being treated as far-right, racist, and all this stuff. The local council where I was in Norwich, just as I was leaving, made a decision to criminalize people not just raising the flag, but if you'd said something hateful while you were raising the flag, it became a non-crime hate incident or a hate incident. So there's a lot of similarities between the using of the flag, or turning the flag, a national symbol for people, into this symbol of hate. And I know this is not necessary to do the trucker protest, but I'd be curious to hear your views on that, because Canada's reversed that now. Now it's become a national symbol of pride again.
Yes, that's right. It's sort of whiplash. So when people went out to the overpasses to cheer on the truckers, there were all sorts of Canadian flags being waved. And that was, I think, a new thing for Canada. Americans, have a lot of flags in their front yard, and they wave flags a lot. But Canadians, not so much. And it's the first time, other than an organized Canada Day celebration, it's the first time I can remember people using the Canadian flag as a symbol and to make a political statement. But you're absolutely right. These are ordinary people who are saying, this is Canada, or this is not Canada. This is not what Canada it should be. And a lot of these signs on those trucks and on just handmade signs that people brought to Ottawa quoted the national anthem, glorious and free. There were these lines from the national anthem that were, so Canadians were being patriotic. And also the other thing that came up was the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. People would put that on a protest sign and walk around with it. Or there'd be copies of the Charter in the windshields of the parked trucks that were protesting on Ottawa. So we were basically, as Canadians saying, these are all of the things, our charter, our flag, we're supposed to be about freedom. We're supposed to be standing on guard for our country. And that was the context in which their, concerns were being expressed. And I think it was a very healthy context. I don't think it was at all threatening, but you're right. People who were opposed to this message turned it into this oh, you must be far right, terrible person if you're doing this. And so a real again, very good at labeling people and shutting people down, and not very good at actually listening and hearing the concerns of someone who's not like you.
That's exactly what I heard. I tried to speak to the so-called left. I don't like left and right, but that's the discourse in the UK right now. I kept trying to speak to people on the left, for example, about discourse, and they kept telling me how important discourse is, but then that discourse never really happened at all, and they were very quick to label it. I'm seeing the same patterns over there, and there was a lot of national I'll bring it back. There was a lot of national unity around the flag. Not just with the truckers, but people who had sympathy with that. There was a lot of talk of freedom and how important that was. And over time, it seems like some of that unity around Canadian patriotism has sort of dispersed a little bit. And I'd be curious to know if you see that fragmentation at all, or if you see possibility for that unity to come back.
Well, I'm going to be always hopeful for unity to return, but absolutely the fragmentation. So I live pretty rurally now. I live in a town of 7,000 people, and I am surrounded by farm country. I'm in southwestern Ontario, and around the time of the convoy, a lot of farms had a Canadian flag at the end of the driveway. So when you're driving by on the small little highways, you're seeing those flags, or sometimes they were F. Trudeau flags. But there was, when you drove around town in that period of time, or in the country, you knew what the Canadian flag stood for. It stood for the Freedom Convoy. It stood for, pushing back against the government's mandates, pushing back against all of that pandemic stuff. And then more recently with the, Trump is the problem, and we have to rally around the Liberal Prime Minister because he's going to do a good job of treating, dealing with Trump. The elbows up crowd, they embraced the flag suddenly. And so then I saw some of the farmers taking down the Canadian flags more recently here in my part of the world, because they didn't want to be confused with that more recent wave that the Canadian flag meant something very different. So it's very interesting that even rurally ordinary people are grappling with what does the flag mean and who owns the flag and what does it represent. So it's an interesting time in Canadian history.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well. So you've written a bunch of other books. One of them that I found interesting that I think I'm going to read is The Delinquent Teenager Who is Mistaken for the World's Top Climate Expert, an analysis of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's policies and its processes. I discovered that I was looking up this information, and I have to say I'm very interested for my own personal reasons in going into that. I think it's really interesting, the pushback on not necessarily that climate change is happening necessarily, but the policies behind that can be very suspect. So I'd be very curious to get your take on that, reading that book. So I'd be curious to know what's next for you. You've written this book, you've written a whole bunch of other books, and where can people check out your projects?
So Amazon.ca is a good place. All the books are there. The Delinquent Teenager book is 14 years old now, actually, and it was a very interesting project. I had left journalism for a number of years, and then I sort of started blogging about climate issues, just as a private citizen who was a bit concerned that we weren't hearing the whole story, that we were only hearing half of the story. So I started doing some blogging, and then I discovered that there's this UN body that I've never heard of before called, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And that's important because intergovernmental is the clue that this is governments. And they all get together under the auspices of this UN organization, and they nominate scientists to write a report about what's going on with the climate. And that report gets renewed every, 6 or 7 years. And so my book goes back 14 years. So the report that I'm writing about is a bit in the distance now, but the same principles apply, and simply that this was an organization, because it was a UN body. The journalists just kind of took the press release and said, oh, this is what they do. This is how they do it. This is who is involved. And they never bothered to do really simple fact checking. So when I turned my attention to that organization, I said to myself, I don't have a PhD in physics or geology or any other science that would give me some insight into the actual scientific debates around what's going on with the climate, but I can evaluate an organization. And so this is an organization. And so I did some very basic things, like they said that the organization is made up of the world's top scientists. Well, is that true? Well, there were some very esteemed scientists, but there were also a bunch of activists from Greenpeace and the World Wildlife Fund in very senior roles. And there were graduate students who were still working on their PhDs, who could not in any way be described as the world's top scientists. So, okay, their personnel isn't quite what they describe. Okay, how about their policies and procedures? They say they rely entirely on peer-reviewed literature when they reference research. Is that true? Well, I started looking at the back of the references, and I found all kinds of citations to press clippings, media releases, all sorts of things, working papers, all sorts of things that were not, in fact, peer-reviewed literature. So you have this whole series of claims about what they do and how they do it and who they are, and then it turns out that they're not true. So if you have a UN body that can't describe itself accurately, can't describe its personnel accurately, can't describe its procedures accurately, why in the world would you trust the report that they produce, right? This is a basic credibility issue. So that's sort of that, so it was it was an expose of this organization. Here's what we've been told, but here's what really happens. We should all know about that. So that was a very fun book to write, and it's found an audience internationally, which is really cool. So the vast majority of copies have been sold outside of Canada, not inside of Canada, which is fun. So that the basic ideas of what was going on there are still relevant, even though it's talking about an earlier version of the report.
Well, I love a woman who is not satisfied with what she's being fed and has to go find out the details for herself. I feel like I've found a spirit animal in you, Donna. Everyone should go read that book, but they should also read Thank You, Truckers. Donna, I'm so grateful that you took the time to speak with me today. Thank you.
Thank you.
The truckers went home, the bouncy castles came down, but the backlash never really ended. It carried on in courtrooms and careers on frozen bank accounts and blacklists. And to this day, the punishment continues, sometimes in other forms, whether it's on speech or new tyrannical government controls. And I discuss this kind of thing all the time here on this show. You know, the growing dissent from Canadians on this authoritarianism being imposed on us. So if you like this episode, I would encourage you to like and subscribe, maybe share it around. And as a bonus, you get all the other great shows that feature stories like mine that the other media won't touch. For True North, I'm Melanie Bennett.